Welcome to our Incorporating Social Class Supports Across the Academy webinar. My name is Patty Webb, and I'm the Marketing Manager for Stylus Publishing. Stylus author webinars bring you direct access to our authors and their latest titles. Please feel free to post any questions in the chat as well as the Q&A, and our panelists today will be able to answer those as we go along. Today, I'm happy to introduce Georgianna Martin and Sonja Ardoin, lead editors for our forthcoming title, Social Class Supports, Programs and Practices to Serve and Sustain Poor and Working Class Students Through Higher Education. Georgianna Martin is Associate Professor of Counseling and Human Development Services at the University of Georgia. Her primary research interests are on the social class identity and college experiences of low-income first-gen students, the impact of college students' out-of-class experiences on key learning outcomes, such as critical thinking and socially responsible leadership, and social and political activism. Sonja Ardoin is a learner, educator, and facilitator. She currently serves as Assistant Professor of Student Affairs Administration at Appalachian State University. Sonja studies social class identity and higher education, college access and success for first-gen students and students from rural areas, student and women's leadership and professional preparation, and career pathways in higher education and student affairs. She also has a couple books with Stylus as well. They are joined today by chapter contributors Mark Chung Kwan Fan of University of Michigan, Sarah Gamez, Cal Poly Pomona, Dave Nguyen, Ohio University, and Desiree Pope Bland from Columbus State Community College. So welcome everyone, and I will leave it to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Patty. We are so excited to be with everybody today and to have these amazing chapter authors with us to chat a little bit about their chapters and just in general, how we can provide supports focusing on social class, both inside and outside the classroom in higher education. Very excited about the forthcoming release of this book and sort of this project that we've been working on for the past couple of years. So I wanted to give everybody on the call a little bit of background about the book before turning it over to Georgianna and our panelists for the bulk of the chat here today. So as we think about the book and sort of what happened to make this come to pass, it actually really all started over lobby beverages at an ASH conference in Tampa. And so ASH is the Association of the Study of Higher Education, which is an association and conference that focuses on sort of research in higher education a little bit broadly. So lots of faculty, doctoral students, master students, and scholar practitioners who attend that conference. And so like lots of good ideas happen. We were just chatting and Georgianna brought up this concept of, hey, I've been thinking about, there's really a gap in the literature about practices, like scalable practices about what's happening around social class. And so sort of from that initial conversation, we wrote a proposal to Stylus. We're very appreciative to have that proposal go under contract. And so John Von Noring and the team at Stylus have really been working with us to expand this project. And so we did a call for proposals and there was an overwhelming response. And so our initial contract, we actually went back to John and Stylus and said, hey, there is amazing stuff that we want to be able to share that people are doing on their campuses that we believe will be beneficial to higher education institutions across institutional type. And so can we double the amount of words and pages that we have in this text? And so thankfully, John believed in us and believed in the chapter authors. And so we were able to expand the proposal as well as the forthcoming project as well. And what that sort of looks like for us is that we now have a book that's 398 pages, and it includes 60 different, not different, but 60 chapter authors, as well as 30 different chapters that are focusing specifically on how colleges and universities are supporting students around the identity of social class. And so it really is a book about scalable practices, both in the classroom, but also in the co-curricular, what that's looking like with external partners as well. And so how we sort of organize and thought about the book is in sort of these 6 parts. And so really starting with access and thinking about how do poor and working class students gain access to higher education. And then we started thinking about once they're there, then what happens? And so we have a section on basic needs, thinking about things around food security, around clothing, around mental health supports. And so really thinking about those everyday things that students need to be able to show up and to be able to contribute in the classroom, but also outside the classroom in higher education. And then we really thought about academic and learning learning supports. So what is happening with faculty in the classroom, but also what is happening in terms of learning supports that can help students in the academic realm in their pursuit of a degree, whether that is a 2-year or 4-year degree. And then academic advising. And so knowing that happens in different realms, sometimes that is through faculty members, sometimes that is through professional academic advisors. And so what does that look like in terms of thinking about social class as we are working with students in the role of academic advising? And then one of our meatier sections, I think there are 6 chapters in this section, is talking about support for at the intersections of identity. So social class and so it might be social class and students who identify as Black women, or social class and students who identify as LGBT, or social class and students who identify as being former foster youth. And so having folks think about what does this look like at the intersection, because we know that not all students experience social class identity in the same way, even if they identify similarly. And so what does that look like at those identity intersections? And then finally, looking at supports through external partnership. And so how are we working with our colleagues in fundraising and development to increase sort of grant funding or philanthropic giving to support some of these scalable practices? What does it look like to partner with community-based organizations, as well as what might be happening in terms of research centers and or efforts through professional associations, such as the NASPA Socioeconomic and Class Issues in Higher Education Knowledge Community. And so really sort of thinking about this from entry point to sort of both academically and co-curricularly, but also how are we partnering with things that already exist as well. And so that is sort of how we framed the book in terms of these 6 different parts. And so we do have some folks here with us today who wrote some of those chapters. And so that is sort of how the book came about. And I will hand it over to Georgianna to talk with our chapter authors about how they've engaged with this topic in their specific chapters.
Thank you, Sonja. Let me just reiterate how happy we are to have you all here with us. That was an excellent introduction to our process and the organization of this book. You will see that we have 4 panelists here who've all written chapters in the book. And as you just heard from Sonja's introduction, that's a small sample of the many folks who've contributed. And this wouldn't have been possible without their contributions. So we're excited that these 4 folks are here with us. And I think they really represent some of the key areas across the book that Sonja just mentioned. So without further ado, because I want to make sure we have plenty of time for them to share with you and then for you to ask questions, the way this will work is I will sort of moderate the panel. And I have a few questions that we'll sort of ask them and have them respond to. And then we'll leave it open at the end for you to ask some questions as well. So to get us started, if each of our panelists could just give us a brief overview of your chapter and some of the high points that you'd like our attendees here today to know. And before you jump into that overview, if you just give us a quick brief introduction of yourself. I know we had that initial introduction, but just to remind folks that are here who you are, pronouns, where you are, anything that's you feel is pertinent. So why don't we start with Sarah?
Hi, good morning for us on the west side, and good afternoon to everybody on the East Coast. My name is Dr. Sarah Gamez. I go by she, her, hers, ella, and I am a former foster youth, but also practitioner scholar, and I have the privilege of serving as the Associate Director for Student Support and Equity Programs at Cal Poly Pomona. And happy National Foster Care Month. So May is National Foster Care Month. So I'm excited to be a part of this panel and to be able to share some of the work that I've been blessed to do both at Cal Poly and at Cal State Fullerton in supporting foster youth in higher education.
Thank you. We'll go in order of who's next on my screen. So Dave.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dave Nguyen. I use he, series pronouns. I'm an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at Ohio University and also our program coordinator. My chapters specifically focused around how making academic materials low or no cost to students. So in that particular chapter with my colleagues, Katie Matthews and Brad Cohen, we specifically we're looking at different ways of engaging with the library as a source of support for poor and working class students, and thinking about how instructors and faculty and institutional supports can get behind, the use of course reserves, engaging with library staff to find electronic materials, as many of us have experienced during the COVID pandemic. Engaging with electronic materials makes things a little bit easier for distribution to a lot of different audiences, and also the process of trying to encourage faculty to use open educational resources as a way of creating low cost or no expense whatsoever to students, and in particular poor and working class students. And another chapter that I can talk about a little bit today is with my colleague, Carly Rosati, who's the Associate Director of Student Success Initiatives at Rice University. And we were talking about how to train faculty and staff about engaging with first generation college students and thinking about what is the role of support, what does it mean to be a supporter, and then also thinking about what are ways that institutions put up barriers for poor and working class students in particular, and thinking about how can an institution like Rice be more supportive of students identifying as poor and working class.
Thank you. Okay, Desiree.
Good afternoon here, and I am Desiree Pope Bland, and I serve Columbus State Community College as the Vice President of Student Affairs. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. So my chapter is related to community colleges partnering with community-based organizations, and really detailing some of the work that Columbus State has done with organizations in our community. So there's a community-wide pool around how we work with the community on basic needs support, on employment, on people earning family sustaining wages. And so community organizations, we've sat at the same table and determined we're serving the same people. And so how do we do that better together? And how do we align our strategies to get them the support they need to complete degrees or certificates and enter them into the workforce? So it's aligning the work of community-based partnerships and social service agencies and doing that work on the college campus.
Great. Mark, last but certainly not least.
Yes, thank you, Georgianna. Hi, folks. My name is Mark Chung Kwan Fan. I go by the pronouns he, him, and his, and I'm one of the assistant directors at the Spectrum Center at University of Michigan, and we're the Gender and Sexuality Center here. No surprise, our chapter is around LGBTQ identities at the intersection of poor and working class students, and I have to thank our my co-authors, Roman Christians and Raven Smith, as well, for helping me, really deliver that work in the ways of excellence, right? So our chapter more specifically talked about, the nuances more here at University of Michigan. We know that we have a high affluent community of students here, that tuition is not cheap either. We have about 50% out of state. So that kind of tells you the demographic of the students that we work with. And oftentimes we forget about our poor and low income students as well, right? So we, here at Spectrum Center, we really work around committing to some practices. And our chapter talks about 4 specific practices around identity-based centers, more specifically gender and sexuality centers, and supporting poor working class students, which I'm happy to talk more about later on today. So we offer those in a way where, it's more practical and outside of a classroom support that offers, poor working class students the support that they've been looking for at institutions that are predominantly white, but also high affluent communities as well.
Great, thank you. I think recognizing that we have a variety of folks on the webinar today who, some folks are likely experienced with developing programs and initiatives for poor and working class students, and some folks are maybe coming to this new. And, so thinking about just the diversity of folks who are represented here in terms of where you're at in support for poor and working class students, I'm wondering if the panelists can talk to us a little bit about why you think it's important to consider social class when you're creating such student supports. And I'll just open it up to whoever sort of feels the spirit, so to speak.
I can get the conversation started. So I think it's important to consider, and many of you on this webinar probably know or have experienced in some ways, that higher education and education writ large is a classed institution. And that comes from, the cost of participating, particularly in post-secondary education, and the availability of funds that folks might have to be able to pay to participate, to pay tuition, pay fees. But that's just one piece of the puzzle here, and thinking about the larger engagement pathways for folks on campuses. So thinking about, how much does it cost to join a student organization? How much does it cost to pay to participate in a particular event? So, money in many ways, shapes the kinds of behaviors or the kinds of things that people can engage with. I also think about, when you come to a college campus, this is the confluence of different social classes that meet all in one place, and it's a microcosm of society. And starting to think about how, folks from different backgrounds come and interact, and the ways in which that they think about money, or the ways that they've been raised, and the kinds of values that people values, taste, and preferences that people hold for different things on college campuses. So I think really it's just important to start to consider, the class nature of post-secondary education. And as a result of that, oftentimes institutional, departmental, programmatic barriers get put up in the place of supporting students, though it's not intended to be that way, but it becomes part of the larger fabric of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Yeah, if I can add too, when we think about like the various student populations, right, that an institution really serves, some with the multiple identities and intersections, some which identities we don't necessarily see right up front visually, right? For example, with our foster youth student population, social class plays a very critical experience with what they're coming to our institutions with, but there's also some underlying experiences that they also bring that are often not talked about, such as family privilege. And so on top of some of the financial barriers that some students, even that experience challenges financially in trying to figure out, how do I pay for college? Where, how am I going to afford all of the things that a college student can experience? Our young people with experience in foster care often come without any familial support. And so they can't necessarily call upon family to for encouragement, for support, for, hey, I need, a couple bucks just to get through this next week. And so a lot of our programs, and as my co-author, Dr. Kizzy Lopez, we outlined in the chapter, we talked about family privilege, but we also talked about how programs have created emergency type support to assist students when some of those critical instances that can become roadblocks for students that would impede them from continuing their education, where students might think twice about continuing because there's so much going on in their lives, and they don't have someone or something to fall back on for support or encouragement. So there are a lot of critical pieces when we think about social class and different types of identities that our students intersect with, that we really have to consider and think about how we as institutions are supporting students, but also helping to break down some of those barriers that students might encounter.
And I'll add a little bit for, I agree with my co-panelist here. And I also will say that we talk a lot about education as the great equalizer, but education can also be the means to replicate what's currently happening in society when there's an access issue. So if we're talking about the class and working poor and the need for basic needs for students, if an institution, if a college is not recognizing that, students don't even think education's an option if they feel like they have to work, they have to raise kids, they have transportation barriers. And so who are we keeping out? So it's the acknowledgement of there is a class that we are keeping out. And so when you sit and work with your social service providers who are also saying, we need to find jobs, good family sustaining wage paying jobs for our clients, and the community college pathway to a credential or a degree will get them to that level. That's when it starts to level set the conversation of, are we providing this equalization, or are we still doing this replication? Because who gets in is who gets in. And then so until you start to recognize who's not at your door, who's not at the and the reasons they're not. So really do a deep dive of why aren't people who can benefit, that we feel can benefit from education, aren't with us, and start to dissect what you do as an institution and really start to lay out, here are the barriers, here are the things, even as a community college. I mean, we, you know, I write in the chapter that we tout this open access mission, but we have to explore what access means and access to what. So I think it's critically important that we really understand and work with these issues of class as an institution so that we can bring more into this and really live out that mission of being that equalizer. So.
I mean, I love that you mentioned that, Desiree. I think that, you know, access is really important, as well as retention, right? So oftentimes we offer all those scholarships and grants and financial assistance to get people in the door. And once they are in, there's no more financial support, right? So when we think about that, especially at institutions of high privilege, financial privilege, right? Like there's not a lot of support while they are on campus as current students. One of the thing that I want to mention too is about like the fluidity of those identities as well, right? So at least with LGBTQ students, you know, folks might not have supporting families when they come out. So they just, you know, become either independently financially independent, or right, they just lose all that status and they end up dropping out of school, or they end up, you know, taking more loans that they're not able to afford to pay back eventually. So I want to say that, you know, as we look at our students, we might know them in the first year of school, right, coming from like legacy families or affluent families, and by the senior year, you know, they have lost everything, right? And that is oftentimes a difficult process to navigate with FAFSA as well, or the Office of Financial Aid, which, you know, we don't have that type of support typically in terms of being able to help out our students. My last point I want to mention, you know, and I learned that from Sonja actually and Becky Martinez in the book Straddling Class, is that, you know, it's oftentimes a subject that is taboo, right? We don't talk about social class. It's invisible not just to the site, but also to the conversations as well. And that's something that needs to be changed, right? Not just on campus, but also, you know, among the students that we serve as well.
Thank you all for that. You know, something that I think all of the panelists really just touched on, and really something that I think is a thread throughout the book, is really this idea that access doesn't end when a student gets admitted to college. And I think for so long, the literature in higher education around access has focused on entry, right? And something that is really consistent across this book is, okay, and, right? It's a both and. They have to get admitted to go to college, and what happens once they're admitted? So thank you all for bringing that up so beautifully and highlighting what I think is a very common thread across this text. So thinking about some of the tangible ways that these things happen, I'm wondering if the panelists can share with us, you know, what are some suggestions that you all have for, you know, if a professional or an office, university, you know, whatever the unit is, right, wants to get started with establishing some ports for poor and working class students, or scale some initiatives that they've seen happen from their peers, what's some advice that you can offer them to make those things happen?
So I'm going to start by saying, you know, transparency and destigmatizing, you know, the topic, right? Oftentimes when I think of anti-racist organizations, I think that there needs to be more transparency in how the budget is handled, how the budget is allocated, what goes to student programming and what goes to student support, right? Which oftentimes are the itty bitty bits, right, of the larger budget, right? So transparency for me is something that I think is really valuable, not just for our colleagues, but for our students as well, to know where does the student fees go, right? And the destigmatization of the topic, right? So thinking about, you know, that's something that we can talk openly, and we should talk openly about, right? And not have shame or embarrassment in terms of talking about social class, because that's, you know, sometimes how people feel And that's not, that should not be the case as well, right? We're here to support students, and that's the main message that they should know. I have a few more points, but I want to pass it on to the panelists as well.
If I can add, I think for individuals or campuses who might be interested, right, in starting a support program for students with experience in foster care, knowing, right, that our program has been around for over 19 years now, it is challenging, right? It is challenging financially to be able to get to a place where you can fully fund a student and then fully fund a whole program of students, the staffing, the space, all of those things. But if you're trying to start something, right? We all have to start somewhere. And so one of the key things I would definitely encourage is to find champions on your institution. People who you can talk about the importance of serving this population and serving them with their unique needs, right? Because their experience is very nuanced. And it is important to identify those champions in higher administration, higher leadership, but also faculty, staff, anywhere where you can find them, so that you're spreading an awareness about that experience for students and what is needed to support them for their success at our institutions. Because they have the intersections of multiple identities and multiple spaces across campus, but that experience of having emancipated from the foster care system adds a lot of complexities to their college experience and to the work that they're going to have to do to get through, and especially the support of mental health on campus and stable housing.
So I would agree that the conversation around where do you start, it is finding those champions and finding people who are currently doing things. So the work that we're doing, we have wonderful champions on our campus. So our community partner for food is the Mid-Ohio Collective in Ohio, and we have a market. So we don't call it it's the Mid-Ohio Market at Columbus State. We don't call it a pantry. It is a market. It's a shop through fresh produce, fresh meat, dairy. It is a shop through experience for students. And where that started, right? So we have a champion on our camp. I don't know if she's on today, but Barb Smith Allen is a champion around food. And she started this partnership with Mid-Ohio Collective, where they would come on campus maybe 2 or 3, 4 times over the summer, where, and produce giveaways. And so we started with this small thing. And then our faculty said, we're having challenges because students are hungry in the classroom. Right? So we had faculty champions that said, we're going to do outside of office doors, we're going to do shelves and baskets of fruit and snack, right? So the food piece was really tangible, that people could actually deliver. And so we started with food from some really grassroots, passionate people. So those champions are incredibly important. Students are incredibly appreciative. And our partners in the community said, we will help you blow this out, right? We will help you. So reach out to understand who your internal champions are. And to me, it's who your external partners are, because as my fellow panelists meant, funding is the challenge. So to fund entirely and keep stocked a food market, Columbus State probably would not be equipped to do. But because it is the mission of the Mid-Ohio Food Collective, that is what they get their funding for. And that made it more feasible for us to give the space and the staff, and for them to give the food. So I think you find your champions, you find your grassroots efforts, and you see who can blow this out. But it is also up the administrative chain that we need to support these kinds of efforts, because this is the response we're getting from students. So those champions are critically important.
So I absolutely agree with all of the other panelists. I want to take it in a little bit of a different tack, just thinking about it from the academic standpoint, based on the chapter I wrote about free or reduced price course materials. Part of it in this particular chapter was given rise from the former Ohio Governor John Kasich, who was looking at college affordability. And one of the ways that he had sort of advanced this idea was to look at course materials. And so Ohio University, the context for which the chapter is set, started to take a look at what are the different things that institutionally as well as faculty can do to reduce the cost burden on students in particular. And so in this, looking at open educational resources, thinking about not only the champions, but who are potential partners on a particular campus to help elevate and advance some of these ideas that people are putting out there. So in this case, the library became a natural partner in terms of developing online educational resources and open access resources for folks. There was a bit of economic muscle from the provost and the Center for Innovation on our campus that incentivized faculty members to participate in these types of trainings, as well as incentivizing them further to incorporate open educational resources into their course materials. So in terms of thinking about scalability, some of the considerations are, of course, I think there's a monetary aspect to many of the things that folks are talking about in terms of like getting things up and running, whether that's creating space. But I think that if you look closely at your institution, there may be different unlikely but natural partners in thinking about this too. So in my particular case, thinking about the Center for Teaching and Learning, thinking about approaching the provost's office about the kinds of supports that are needed to help fund the academic success of students. Much of what we talk about in this particular chapter with my co-authors stems from a research project that I did where many students were talking about just how expensive textbooks were and the types of processes that they would specifically engage in thinking about whether or not they should buy a textbook and or what is the last possible day to return a textbook. So some students would buy them really early on and try to do as much of the class as they possibly could so that they could return it within 2 weeks. Other students tried to wait out as far as they could go without it substantially, it did substantially affect their grades. So some students would say, like, maybe I waited 3 or 4 weeks to buy the textbook and I missed a bunch of assignments along the way, but I know if I completed the rest of them, I could get at least a B. And so really thinking about, who are those partners and how can you create those advocacy kinds of positions for folks. So in this particular case, bringing them to faculty members, talking to the library, centers for teaching and learning. And also sometimes institutions have research funds or innovation ideas or money for innovation ideas that you can pitch these kinds of proposals towards.
If I can add real quick to what our panelists have shared too, you've highlighted, collaborating and partnering with our champions, right? Whether in academic affairs or in student life. And I would say for us, what we're trying to do in doing that, right, is really to provide a language, right, of how to talk about poor working class students. How do we talk about, at least in my chapter, LGBTQ students? Because when we talk about the fundraisers, when we talk about the folks in positions of power, oftentimes they don't have the language to be able to talk about the student experience or the understanding, right? So I think that's the facilitation of that dialogue is something that is really important and that we try to do as well when we talk about LGBTQ poor and working class students. Lastly, I'm just going to mention that, what I've seen so far too is that we are trying so hard to meet basic needs, right, of our students. And some offices might be like, we've done that, what's next, right? And I would challenge us not to limit ourselves to basic needs, but also to like, how do our students thrive, right? How can we financially assist them to just be, not just again, like be the basic needs, but be successful in college, right? So that's a challenge I throw to everybody, in the audience, is that don't limit yourself to just basic needs. If you're getting there, if you're trying to get it, that's great, but try to go beyond as well.
Yeah, and Georgianna, if I could just add with all that it's so important, right, as you start identifying your champions across campus, that for the student connection, right, for a student to feel like the sense of belonging to our institutions, it is important that we also identify those points of contacts in all the different offices, because we as a program will not do everything the institution does. We collaborate across the institution. And so it's so important to develop those partnerships and identify key points of contacts that students can then go over and connect to help kind of give that warm handoff that makes such a such a difference in the experience that students have in feeling like I am important, I do belong here, somebody cares, versus feeling like it's more just transactional and they're just a number in our institutions, especially when we're talking about first generation students who all of this is new to them, right? And so if we just say, go to the financial aid office and, go talk to someone, or just go talk to someone in the office, that just in itself can be very intimidating for students. But if they know exactly who they need to go see and that person is expecting them, that will make a world of a difference for students. So also making sure that we are keeping students' voices at the center and at the front of the initiative, right? Because the student populations that come in through our institutions, right? Each cohort has its own kind of identity in itself, right? They all come with something because they're from kind of a different generation per se. And so we have to also understand that and be ready for that. So continuously asking students if what we're doing is working, is supporting them, and if not, where are the gaps? And for us to then challenge ourselves to say, okay, if they're identifying these are gaps, how do we address those? How do we continue to evolve our programs to meet the current needs of the current students we're serving?
Really good advice there. Thank you all so much. Another question I'd like to pose to our panel, in thinking about some of the challenges that we've all faced this past year, what's some advice you have for translating some of these ideas or supports to a virtual space? What might that look like? And I know some of us are still trying to figure all of that out.
So I can get us started here. So so this is about a chapter I haven't talked about yet at this point, but one of the pieces that I also collaborated with some folks from across the country relates to graduate student support and it was about the creation of student organizations for graduate students in supporting their professional development. I think more than ever, actually, there's a lot of real opportunity in institutions or across the country to find people, particularly in virtual settings, to create these professional development opportunities. If you think back, 18 months ago, there weren't a whole lot. There were webinars, but they weren't as popular as they are today. And thinking about how the delivery of information has changed and shifted. So in this particular case, I think a lot about the creation of a student organization that focuses on professional development. It's so easy now. I mean, yes, people are very busy and have different kinds of schedules, but you can invite people to be guest speakers, to participate in professional development for graduate students, and talking about what that looks like, and really thinking about how to leverage the online space for things on how to do that. And thinking about some of the course material pieces, many of our faculty members now are actually embracing open educational resources as a way to connect with students to reduce the cost burden on them. One thing that I do in some of the courses that I teach is that I also have my own sort of like DVD collection of all of the course films that people are going to watch. So some people don't live nearby, some people don't have high-speed internet access, and so I'll actually mail them a DVD, and hopefully they have a DVD player or some other mechanism for that. But being able to come up with alternative ways of delivering the content to folks, I think is so incredibly important. And then as it relates to the training part of the Rice chapter, there's a lot of on-demand opportunities now to be able to record short bits of information that can then be pushed out to folks. So thinking about how do we do these first generation poor and working class training sessions, record them and make them available so people can listen to them, watch them when they're not cognitively overloaded and can specifically spend time engaging with the materials. So those are a couple of ways that I think that the virtual setting actually has been a little bit more helpful in thinking about how do we get content to people, how do we create community, and then ultimately how do we connect them together.
And I'll add to that, this virtual environment. So I will say, a year ago, there were things that people really said, we will never be able to do that online. I mean, there was a lot of almost foreclosure on, we can't do that kind of work online. We can't teach those type of classes or perform those kinds of social services. And we've really demonstrated that we can, and we can do it fairly well, right? So now we have these conversations about return to campus, and it's like, well, wait a minute, we can do this online. It's almost a complete reverse right now, which is it's a good challenge to have. And so understanding that change really was, how do we support students, right? So we spent a lot of time really supporting faculty who needed to convert material and so it was, how do we then support students, and how do we support students where, I mean, we all consider that broadband is a universal thing. Broadband is not a universal thing. So how do we make sure that our students actually have the broadband, the technology? And because we as a campus went virtual, so did the entire world. So our students who had children, if you know, we learned lessons. Like, we sent out a survey and said, do you have technology? And our students said yes, right? But their child was using it during the day for school. So it was, so next iteration, do you have technology that you alone can use? Because we need you to borrow equipment from us so that you can do your schoolwork as well as your child being able to do their schoolwork. And so some of this what lessons learned is understanding how to ask a question, understanding that more people fell into this category of having need. And we talked a lot earlier, people used the phrase, you know, destigmatizing this concept of support. And so trying to really lay out for students, these are things you have access to at this institution. So you have access to tutoring, and you have access to our fitness center, and you have access to our Mid-Ohio market, and you have access to our technology. It is in a long string of, these are the things, and they are for you to use. So in this virtual world, we've been able to push out messaging in a way, and it's complex because, as I just said, everyone doesn't have the technology. So how do you push out technology? Well, you do a technology. We did a technology survey via technology. Wasn't ideal, if students didn't have the technology, you couldn't respond to the survey. And so we just kept chipping away at what are the ways in which we can get responses from students. But it's been a challenging year from a technical sense, but being able to really support students. And I spent a lot of time talking about supporting students because I'm student affairs, right? It's what I do. But we've got a whole team of people, from academic advisors to people who do caseload management, holistic supports that need that support too, because they all had to turn on a dime. And when resources became available, they didn't necessarily come available for those teams. And so it's also making sure your teams have what they need to do their jobs, because in the long run, that supports students in different ways, right? So it has been a complex time, and I think institutions have really risen to the occasion, not in a perfect way, but really leaps and bounds above where we were a year ago in this world of transitioning to this virtual environment.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I agree with Desiree and what she shared, because it has impacted every one of us at the institution, right? In whatever level of work you do at our campuses. And so in thinking about how do we translate the work that we were doing in person to now in this virtual space, and having been going through it over a year, one of the things that we've obviously have all experienced is that Zoom fatigue, right? I'm tired of being on the screen. I'm tired of another meeting on the screen. And so are our students, right? For classes, for everything that we're asking them to do there, and email overload. Everybody is sending an email about anything and everything. And so students are just not responding to email. And so one of the things that, we've talked about in spaces where we're talking about how do we support this foster youth population, and specifically in the work that I do, is picking up the phone and literally calling them on the phone, right? To giving them a different way of connecting, because they may not want to get on a Zoom with you again. They're over it, right? And so then how do we continue to engage and connect them and help them feel connected to the campus? It may not work as well, right, with doing a group kind of work, but for that individual one-on-one, maybe it's doing a phone call versus doing a Zoom meeting to help alleviate some of that Zoom fatigue for students to continue to help them stay connected with staff, faculty, and all of that.
One thing I will add about how we addressed it during COVID is our relationship with the university development, right? I feel like, we need to tap more into our colleagues out there, because as we're experiencing budget cuts or, a decrease in funding, the only way for us, at least here, is to be able to tap from the pockets of our alumni and donors, right? And to really communicate with them where their needs are, and not just ask them for money, and that's it, but communicating the needs of our students and where the money is going to go and how it's going to be helping students, because that typically brings a more of a motivation for our donors to be able to give to the university and support students as well. So I would just highlight that relationship, because I think it's important for us to leverage that and really cultivate those relationships there.
Really great ideas. Thank you all. I know there's been quite a learning curve this year. And as Desiree pointed out, many institutions have risen to the occasion, perhaps not perfectly, but we're all learning for sure. I know we have some questions coming in on the back channel, and I imagine there might be other folks who want to chime in with questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Sonja to help facilitate some of those questions.
Absolutely. So we have two questions specifically, and maybe I'll ask for time purposes a couple of folks to answer the first one and a couple of folks to answer the second one. The first one is from Christina, and she put in multiple questions about emergency funding. And so we were having some exchanges back and forth in the question box. And her question particularly was things like emergency funding pre-COVID really was just between students and student affairs. Not many other people on campus knew about emergency funding and how maybe they could refer students to it and those sorts of things. And so sort of thinking pre-COVID, but also what might happen post-COVID. What might be specific techniques or practices that allow student affairs to link better with academic affairs to assist students so everybody knows what supports exist on campus? Any ideas about that?
So I'm happy to give an example of what we've done. I mean, so we have a team in student advocacy is the office, and they developed this training called CARES training, and it is around because we have concerned faculty who are constantly saying, I don't know what to, I'm like, where do I refer the student? How can I help the student? So to empower them, we really developed a training to say, here are your avenues of support. Community referrals, if a student prefers, internal college referrals, internal mechanisms, like if it's emergency fund, if it's a computer loan, if it's the housing program, the Mid-Ohio Market. So it's a training around how to ask questions, because you've got, it's community college. We have faculty members who are in some of our sort of STEM and hard hands-on who said, I'm not a trained counselor. I don't know how to ask these questions, but how to ask questions, how to really understand your students, how to make proper referrals, and then here are the referrals. So there's like a level 1 and a level 2 of this kind of training, and we put it out periodically for whoever comes, and then we do special requests for the training in the academic departments. And I will tell you that COVID hit, and the request for that training and the number of attendees in the training spiked, because you do have really caring and concerned faculty members, right? That academic affairs touch. We always say you have access to students more than we do in student affairs, right? They're not turning in assignments, they're missing, so things are happening to them, and they're going to share that with you. And we have some supports. And so we are trying to do that together now, those kinds of trainings together, and getting people involved in that. So that particular mechanism has worked, and due to COVID, it's been a stronger connection. So I will say that.
Great, thanks for that, Desiree. And I'll add to that, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Gamez, but is thinking about not just how are we training faculty, but how are we also training because our custodial staff workers, our dining hall workers, our administrative sort of personnel who are more frontline perhaps, because they too notice things that are happening with our students and can offer some of those referrals as well. And so as we're thinking about training folks, how are we thinking about the campus writ large, perhaps then maybe just specific niches as well? Dr. Gamez?
Yeah, and I agree with Desiree and what she shared in the approach that her institution took. Our campus took a similar approach as well in creating our Broncos Care kind of like ally program. But one of the things that I think was very successful in us being able to reach more faculty, because our Broncos Care program is out of student affairs. However, we attended academic senate meeting put it on the academic senate's like radar and really encouraging them, like, we want to partner with you to help equip the faculty with this information, right? We're here to support the students that we all are serving at our institution. And that was really helpful for us to get a lot of faculty interest in wanting to learn more. And so they were really well attended, and that will continue to kind of touch on the little pockets of different groups that need to have this information to know what that referral process is and where the supports are.
Great, thank you both for that. We also have a question from Elizabeth that says, how can we help our poor and working class students create community and share cultural capital? It's beyond basic needs, it's about social and emotional needs. And talks about first-gen students in focus groups told us that they felt socially isolated and feels like everybody else knows a secret language. Any thoughts on how to create that kind of community or shared cultural capital?
I can start. So there are some institutions in particular that have student organizations that are specifically around Pell eligible or students that identify as poor or working class. So there are a number of ways for institutions to think about creating those kinds of organizations to be support mechanisms. Many institutions now, if we separate that out and think about first generation students, there are many institutions that have first generation student organizations. Sometimes there's overlap between those kinds of organizations. Sometimes there's not, and they handle different kinds of things. The other thing that I think a lot about is the role of programming on campuses, particularly around like student engagement or in the residence halls, and thinking about, ways that you can create free programming for folks to create events that just kind of creates a sense of community as for example, like a floor event where the RA, is using some money to from their floor to be able to create events for folks on like Friday or Thursday evenings as a way of just sort of connecting folks. I think that's something that can go a long way in terms of building community. I think the student organizations provide sort of like a larger venue for having more larger conversations around how does one develop cultural capital and using it as a way of demystifying some of the things that are happening on campus, as well as being able to connect people with the kinds of resources that students might be interested in looking for, and using the student organization as a vehicle for identifying what needs of the student population is. So those are kind of two ways that I initially sort of think about this.
Yeah, I also have two suggestions as well. We mentioned about food pantries, and we have a laptop loan program here at U of M, right? Figure out, right, like what are the venues that your poor and working class students frequent, right? And maybe have pamphlets or outreach materials there to ask them, would you want to build community? And if you do, here's a time and place or a Zoom link, right, where you can do that every so often. And I think that, we can allow them to choose, right, like whether they want to be able to join those communities, because not everybody has time for that, as Dave mentioned before, to opt in, right? The other thing that I want to mention, kind of continue on this topic of transparency and visibility is, we had a few panels about LGBTQ and socioeconomic class, here at U of M. They were all virtual, but people attending those virtual webinars were so appreciative of having representation models, as Laverne Cox coined, right? Of seeing people who identify as them, who went through their shoes and their experiences, right? And are now thriving and are now, right, like professors and whatever title you want to have, at the university. But it's been really rewarding for us at the center here to see that, people are appreciative of seeing others like them as well.
Fantastic. Thank y'all so much for that. I also mentioned in terms of some of the secret code and language, some campuses are doing sort of dictionaries of terminology for putting it on websites or giving that to students at orientation. And so that way everybody has that information. And so you sort of have a guide to pull out and say, oh, somebody just said that, but I don't want to ask them what it was. And so I can refer to a website or to that physical guide if it's a poster or a handout or those sorts of things as well, if we're talking about sort of jargon and terminology and things of that nature. So we're about to be out of time. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Mark and Sarah and Dave and Desiree for being with us. Thank you for the chapters that you contributed to the book. I know that I got to read them, so I know that they're great, but I'm excited for other people to read them as well. So a few final thoughts, and then I'll hand it over to Patty to close us out. But we just did questions, so there you go. But if you are interested in purchasing the book, it is available for pre-sale via the Stylist website. It should be out in the next month or so. And so we are very excited to hold that book in our hands and see it in print in a very short amount of time. And then you have some contact information there for some of us. And so I would imagine that our panelists would also welcome your questions for them as well. And I'll hand it back over to Patty.
Thank you, Sonja. Thank you, everybody, for presenting today. To Georgianna, Sonja, Mark, Sarah, Dave, and Desiree for offering their time and presenting this webinar for us. And thank you to everyone who turned in live with us this afternoon or this morning if you're on the West Coast. If you are interested in pre-ordering social class supports, use code SCS25 to get 25% off the book and free shipping from Stylist Publishing. Social class supports is due out on June 30th. The webinar video replay will be available tomorrow or Friday and will be shared on all of our Stylist social media feeds, as well as emailed directly to everyone who has registered for this webinar. If you have any feedback on this webinar or any requests for further webinars, please feel free to email us directly at stylistinfo@stylistpub.com. Thank you all again and have a great afternoon.